Hi, my name's Phil. I like to talk about politics. In this video I'd like to discuss what now for Brexit after the general election result. But first, if you'd like to see more of my videos, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So, Brexit. First of all, it's going to happen. That is now certain. It will happen next month. In terms of the exact timing, Boris Johnson will bring his withdrawal bill before Parliament again. Remember, he withdrew it during the last Parliament because MPs wanted to scrutinise it and maybe add the odd amendment. That will now not happen. He's going to get a fairly hefty majority, larger than he even needed to get it straight through. So it'll pass through fairly quickly and with no amendments whatsoever. He doesn't have to be in a massive rush for this. Now, realistically, he can't put that before Parliament early next week because there will be a Queen's speech needed and they'll be wasting a lot of time in the week on that. But he will be able to bring it before Parliament by the end of next week. Getting very close to the Christmas recess, that will probably happen. I don't see it's in anyone's interest to not have that because he'll be fine coming back after Christmas and finishing it off. Like I say, there's not going to be any scrutiny of it and there's not going to be any amendments there. And as soon as it happens, we can leave the EU. He doesn't necessarily even need to wait until January the 31st, which is where the deadline is for. So, yeah, next month we will be leaving the EU. So it's not a case of now EU referendum or anything like that. That's gone. It is now a case of soft or hard Brexit. Now, especially if you've been listening to me, you would have thought, well, he's going for the hard Brexit. He wants the hard Brexit, doesn't he? Yes, I think he probably does. However, there is now an element of doubt. We have to go back a few years just to consider why it was that Theresa May decided to go for a general election when she had a majority. She had a majority in Parliament and she went for a general election anyway, which is always risky. Bear in mind that Boris Johnson would have loved to have the slender majority that Theresa May had back in 2017. That would have been enough for him, but it wasn't enough for her. Why was that? That was because she would be held hostage by the far right within her party. Particularly the more dedicated members of the ERG, including Jacob Rees-Mogg. Now, what she needed to do was to ensure that if they became difficult, she could plod along anyway, and if they rebelled against her, it wouldn't matter, she'd have enough votes to get it through. So she went for the general election on that basis. The fact that she lost her majority meant that she was completely in the thrall of the hard right, and that's why she shifted further to the right. It was the only way of retaining power. Boris Johnson embraced this when he became Prime Minister. He knew what the score was. He knew he would have to appeal to the far right, and he took the hardest of lines. And absolutely, he would have taken us out of the EU with the hardest of Brexits. Will he this time? Because the issue for him is if he does that, we know what's going to happen. The government have produced their own report on what's going to happen if we crash out the EU with no deal. Now, no one's saying we're going to crash out the EU with no deal next month because we have the transition period as part of the withdrawal agreement. So basically everything carries on as normal. The only difference will be we won't be in the EU, which means we won't get a say in the rules we're going to have to follow. But then, to be fair, that's been the case for the past few years anyway, because we have withdrawn from anything really to do with the EU. We haven't really had much involvement. We've had active MEPs, some of them have even behaved themselves, but we haven't really had top-level negotiations, discussions. We've kept our distance, and that was partly, mutually beneficial because what was the point in us discussing things and trying to promote things for the EU if we were going to be leaving at any time? So that won't even change compared to the last few years. So nothing will actually change. And you know what's going to happen? We'll have left the EU. A few weeks later, people are going, I thought you said the sky would fall in. Nothing's changed. Nothing will have changed during the transition period. The change comes when the transition period ends. Now, the way it was headed so far, if Boris Johnson had just got the slenderest of majorities, what would have happened was he would have had to pretend to negotiate with the EU throughout 2020. Halfway through is the point at which he's supposed to request an extension if necessary. He wouldn't, of course. Carry on, get to the end and go, do you know what? The EU's been really difficult. I've got this perfectly reasonable proposal that they should just give us everything we want without us having to do anything in return. And they just won't go for it. I don't know what to say to you. He's already been doing that. We know that. He's got form. And out we'd go with no deal, and then into the arms of the United States and, their trade deal. That was the path. Now, the problem with that is and I'm sorry to people who still don't understand this, we need trade and we need relatively free trade with the EU. We cannot compensate anywhere else in the world, even with America. And bear in mind, the US trade deal doesn't actually allow us to trade anything more to the US. In fact, it's actually rather less because it demands that we favour US products. So it actually means we import more, for which we pay, we don't earn, and export less, which is how we make our money. So we'll make less money. What we really need to do is to trade with the EU. Now, the US trade deal is completely at odds with any reasonable EU trade deal. And if Boris Johnson takes the soft Brexit approach, which will be preferable for a reason I'll go over in a minute, then the US trade deal is off the table. That can't happen. We know that. So why might he actually even consider a softer Brexit? Well, like I say, if we left with a hard Brexit, we would notice, it doesn't matter what trade we get elsewhere, we would notice that those problems hit in with the EU. Massive delays at the borders because checks would have to be done. And also the civil service say we're not even ready for those checks. And those checks actually have to be done now because of his withdrawal agreement inside the UK, not just our UK borders, inside the UK, between Northern Ireland and Great Britain. And a lot was made before this general election of the fact that that will affect people in Northern Ireland, which is a fairly silly thing to point out because that will obviously impact the people of Northern Ireland, but they don't vote for the mainstream parties in England, Wales and Scotland. But it would also, of course, impact people in the north of England and indeed the rest of the UK, but certainly the north of England because that's where the border would be as well. So goods go both ways and the checks would happen both ways. It's just that more checks would happen coming into Great Britain than going out. Is that right? No, the other way around. Leaving Great Britain. More of a problem for those of us that are left here in what's going to be left of the UK, which of course won't be called the UK anymore, will it? And yeah, it's going to be chaos. We're going to struggle to get things in time. Business is going to go under. All the things that Yellowhammer said would happen will happen. That will still happen even if it happens in a year because there's only so much you can do to mitigate. You can try and mitigate. Checks need to be done. So what do? You need to expand your border force. That's what you need to do. That can help mitigate. And if they do that, but the civil service is saying there's not enough time to do it in a year. There is your problem. And the other problem is, of course, that when do you start doing this? Because the moment you start arranging for those checks is the moment you're saying that we're not going to have a free trade deal with the EU. But he promised us a free trade deal with the EU. Well, then we need lighter checks. Not to say no checks at all, but we need lighter checks. So we can't prepare whatever checks we need until we know what checks we need. And we can't do that until we've got the withdrawal agreement, which, if we're not going to go for the softest of Brexits, it's going to take way more than a year, like several years. So it could be electoral suicide, although the Conservatives are, of course, going to, and they said this in the manifesto, this is not me just second guessing, they're going to shift the boundaries, constituency boundaries. That's going to make it easier for the Conservatives to win more seats. And they're going to make it harder for poorer people to vote. And, there's a number of things they're going to do to make it more difficult for even if there's a good Labour leader next time. And my hopes are not high for that at the moment. Still make it difficult for the Conservatives to be displaced. And of course, all this will have happened after Brexit anyway. But it could be argued that if we end up with a hard Brexit, people will have to pay attention and go, actually, do you know what? The Conservatives have made a right arse of this. Brexit was a disaster. We don't like this. And whatever dirty tricks the Conservatives pull, they'll be voted out of office. They don't want that. They'd really rather not have that. So if they can smooth it out at all, even though it will still be crap. I mean, the last 10 years have been crap, but we've just delivered them a huge majority. So they know we will put up with crap. And don't imagine it's like in some other countries where we'll rise up. We don't rise up. That doesn't happen in this country. few centuries ago, you know, England and France showed their differences, because a lot of psychology is, of course, human psychology. We all behave in the same way ultimately, but then there's the cultural psychology as well. Take France, for example. They were going around lopping heads off left, right and centre on the aristocracy. And look at them now. I'm not saying that was a good thing, by the way, but look at them now. They demand the government do what they want. If they don't, they know about it. They know how to protest properly as well. In this country, we snicked the head off the king. And then fairly quickly afterwards, we said, "Ooh, sorry about that. I think we got a bit drunk. We didn't mean it." And we put the son on the throne and said, "I'm really sorry, it won't happen again." We don't do uprisings in this country. We grumble. And you're going to hear plenty of grumbling from me. But that's what we do in this country. We just grumble about it. So he knows that we will put up with a lot of shit. So if we can smooth it out a little, that will be appealing to him, rather than the cliff edge. So what's changed? The large majority now dilutes the number of real hardliners in the party. It's possible he can shift a little bit away from the far right. Now, he himself is fairly far right, don't get me wrong, and he has a lot in common with the people on the far right. But he's also pragmatic. He'll understand that he needs to appeal to the electorate. He'll also understand that he got away with abandoning the centre ground for this election because Labour also did it. If Labour start to encroach back to the centre left, he'll have to keep an eye on his left flank himself. And again, you know, for the future election, he'll need to keep an eye on that. So we actually don't really know what sort of Brexit is going to happen. We'd still probably say a hardish Brexit is still probably more likely. We know he can't get a deal in a year that would also allow for a US trade deal. And so unless he wants to abandon the US trade deal, we are still looking at a hard Brexit in 2021. But at the same time, I think it will be in his interest, and he'll want to work very hard, or get someone else to work very hard on working out a way to soften it a little bit so that people don't actually notice how bad Brexit is. Just like they haven't apparently noticed how bad the last 10 years of Conservative rule have been. So that's my take on that. I hope you found the video interesting. If you have, don't forget to click the like button, please. And if you'd like to support the channel further, then please click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.